Welcome back to Practically Fearless with Chris Girata. Today, I'm excited to welcome Cullum Clark. He's the director of the George W. Bush Institute, SMU Economic Growth Initiative. He's an adjunct professor of economics at SMU, where he earned his Ph.D. in economics in 2017. He has more than 2 decades of experience in the investment industry, serves on the board of directors for Uplift Education, and has previously done work with many other North Texas organizations. Cullum, thanks for being here.
It is great to be with you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, here we like to talk about ways in which we overcome fear. And so I'd love for you to just kick us off with a little bit about how you came to be at the George W. Bush Institute.
Sure. Well, I was in the investment business for a long time, and it was good. We were in New York for a while. We then moved to Dallas. I got married a Dallas woman a long time ago. We came home, and life was rolling along pretty well. But I always had sort of in the back of my mind this voice that was saying maybe there's something else. In my own particular case, I would say that it was a kind of a little bit of an inner academic trying to break through. It was a voice saying, you need to be using your brain in some new ways. And I think a lot of ingredients went into that. But as my wife could readily tell you, I think there were quite a few years of angst of saying, well, on the one hand, the status quo is working pretty well. You know,
Sure.
It pays reasonably well, and I'm pretty decently good at it, at the investment stuff. But I think that at the same time there was this voice, and the voice grew louder as time went by. So essentially, I tried on for size many ideas about how to sort of break through to some new chapter in life. I tried a lot of ideas on for size. And one day I had an idea that wasn't necessarily at first blush any better than any of the other ideas that I'd had. But the idea was to explore the possibility of going back and earning a Ph.D. in economics. And that led me to initiate one particular conversation that set the rocks rolling down the hill, as it were, set in motion all kinds of changes in my life.
So going back to get a PhD is not something probably most people would consider doing, but the idea of kind of mid-career, making a big shift, that's something that I bet a lot of people have considered in one way or the other. And so what contributed to your courage to actually make that shift?
It's amazing how often people say, gosh, I would really dream of doing a PhD myself. There seems to be a lot of that sentiment out there. It's very interesting. I think in my particular case, there was this sort of growing desire for a new chapter, but there also was, I would say, I had a little bit of a frustrated tendency to be a lifelong learner who never was quite learning enough. Right? Who needed to step on the gas in terms of learning. I think I was kind of wired to be a lifelong learner. I think that kind of ran in the gene pool, you could say, in terms of my parents and grandparents and so on. They all were just big readers, big question askers. My mother very much still is. So I think the question was how to go about being a lifelong learner. And the PhD in economics thing, I could talk about how I came to it. But I'd say the first thing that became clear as I started to go down that path and understand what was involved in it is this is going to be hard.
So I have to think that you were turning down certain parts of your life. Like you had to stop doing a whole lot of things in order to do this thing that you really want to do.
Absolutely.
And so how did that go about? Because you're married, you've got children, and you have just a busy life like any working parent would be. So how did you navigate that kind of difficult, conflict-ridden path?
Well, it's true. I had to stop doing some things. Now, I will say I'm very, very thankful that economics alone didn't stop me from pursuing economics. That I was in a position to be able to afford to do it.
There are very few people who would have reached a point at which you could kind of ride the wave. Like you'd sort of earned it. You'd hustled. You'd gotten to a place where life was not fully, but at least relatively predictable and stable. And you sort of destabilized it by making this choice. That's something I think a lot of people can kind of relate with, because I have to think people listening to this have hopes or dreams or desires that they just never got around to.
Yes.
And they kind of wonder, could they still do it? But one of the biggest hurdles, maybe the biggest hurdle, is not actually economics, but the idea that life is no longer as stable as it has been.
I think life can be too stable, Chris. When I observe around people that I talk to, and I'm now 56, but when I talk to people who are 40-something, 50-something, I don't know too many people who say, my life has arrived at this position of great stability and predictability, and therefore I've arrived. I'm done worrying about it, and now it's great. All I see is people in some form or another wondering what's next.
But there aren't a lot of people who take big steps, like going back to school. And I wonder what might prevent that, because I do think a lot of people probably would like to.
I think that people reaching their 40s or 50s, maybe getting to a point where if their parents, they're approaching or they've entered empty nesterhood, I think the tendency to say to yourself, what's next, is a very strong tendency. That's my, I don't have very many friends who would say, nope, never felt that. The question is what to do about it exactly. So clearly going back to school is not going to be for everybody. But there's a lot of things people can and do take on. I have an ultimate boss in my shop, President George W. Bush. He worked pretty hard at other stuff, including being president of the United States, and then retired from that. And sometime after that, he took up painting.
I've seen
and he'd
his
never
paintings.
done it in any form at all before that, from what I understand. It never even crossed his mind to try it as of the day that he walked out of the White House for the last time. So people do take these things on. So in my case, I'm really fortunate because the thing that I took on really did turn out to be a great fit. So that was fortunate because I entered into something very, very hard. And if it hadn't been ultimately a great fit where I could really start to see, yes, this is worth pursuing. This is actually a really good thing for me. The case for stopping would have been pretty strong.
So I'd love to pivot, but remain within the lane of education.
Yep.
You've done a lot of research and writing and advocacy on what you've described as doubling down on college education, particularly here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I've heard you speak multiple times where you've said the outlook for Texas is so bright, but we're not raising up the kind of workers, essentially, that we need to keep that growth. And so I'd love to hear what you think about what we could do here in Dallas around supporting that kind of continued education.
I think as a first step, we go to kind of the 30,000-foot level. Think very, very big picture. The world has been changing all around us in some pretty profound ways. I teach a class on economic history, and I think it's always useful to go back and put things in a little bit of historical perspective. And we really don't have to go back very far to find a time when maybe our great-grandparents or something like that were overwhelmingly, say, farmers.
Sure.
Overwhelmingly in a world with very relatively limited choices, very limited technologies available, and so forth, where the returns to further education were so limited, were so few things that you could sort of convert education to. That was the reality for human life for
until recently.
If the story of life was a day, I think that was the reality of life until like 11:59 p.m.
Sure.
And then all of a sudden, there's been this enormous cloudburst of change, to a greater degree than ever before in history. A great many people who have fulfilling and challenging lives are going to be doing this very hard thing of continually upgrading and retooling their mind. They're going to keep learning things because they're going to be trying to keep up with some, maybe not the entirety of the world, how fast it's changing, but with some aspects of how the world is changing.
So I assume that means many different kinds of post-secondary education, where it may not look purely academic, but there is this desire or perhaps need for people to become more expert in something.
And absolutely. So yeah, I am a huge believer in post-secondary education in some form. I don't think we're anywhere close to cracking the code of what it would mean to have somebody finish their formal education at age 18 and be able to say that though there's a pretty good chance they'll live to their 90s and might well work well into their 70s, that they are well and truly done with all forms of formal improvement to their mind. So, I mean, I think that even when we talk about some of the really, traditional occupations, working with one's hands with this or that type of equipment, the equipment's totally changed, right?
And changing all the time.
All the time. The people who become carpenters, the people who become electricians, the people who become HVAC installers and repair people, the people who do any of the thousands of jobs in a hospital, say, the equipment's changing all the time. That the level of technical expertise involved is galloping ahead, and so we find, not surprisingly, that the people who go into those fields in a larger and larger percentage of the time are getting some kind of formal training to do it. Now, when you talked about what we need to do in Dallas and in cities everywhere, we're maybe in the fourth inning of a very long transformation in how the higher ed and post-secondary sector work in order to prepare people for this world, and not just prepare them in the sense that they go up to a certain point and say, now I'm done, but where they keep on retooling and upskilling over the course of a lifetime. We're a long, long ways from that. So we could dream together about what is needed. I think a great deal of change already has been occurring, and a very great deal has yet to occur. But I would, in the strongest of terms, tell any young person, of truly just about anybody, they really should be looking at some kind of pathway of further formal education, whatever form it is. Maybe it's in a traditional 4-year school. Maybe it's a traditional 2-year school. Maybe it's in something that we loosely call an apprenticeship. It can take a lot of forms, but they ought to be planning on doing some of it, and they also ought to be planning on returning to it over the years and continuing to kind of do professional development and upgrade.
So we've talked a lot about your professional identity
Yeah.
and your professional experiences. I'd like to turn toward you as a person. I happen to know you are a man of faith, and imagine that there have been points along the way in your life where your faith identity has actually been brought to bear in your decision-making in a pretty explicit way.
Yes.
And so I'd love for you to maybe think back to at least one time in your life where you were faced with a decision, or perhaps you were struggling with something in your life, and you brought your faith life into that decision point, not just perhaps your professional life. Can you think of one of those and maybe give us a little?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I would say we've talked about one transition in my life, which was going back and earning a Ph.D. in economics, which was in 2013 when I started that. But let's go back to the year 2000. In the year 2000, my wife, Nita, and I, and at that point we had 2 daughters. They turned into 3 later. We, in early 2000, had moved back to Dallas from New York City. And we had been here about 7 or 8 months. When we had the greatest moment of transition in our lives, which is when Nita's dad, Vin Prothero, passed away very suddenly, as sudden could be. That was a very, very painful time and a great shock to everybody involved. That led to many conversations worth of reflection and faith journey on the part of all of us, certainly my wife Nita's mom, Karen, Nita's brother, all of us. I oftentimes look back and think, well, before that, we were kind of adults on paper. Officially, we were old enough to vote. I'd had a job for 7 or 8 years at that point in time, had a graduate degree. We'd even had our first 2 kids. But I would say that was a true moment of passing into, let's say, a different stage of adulthood for me, and dare I say, for my wife as well. And speaking for me, at least, a moment of saying, who am I now? What's next? It involved some...
Was that because you sort of, for the first time, like mortality was present to you?
Yes, absolutely. I think that for all of us who've ever lost a parent, I think that is and in my case, I've since lost my dad. This is Nita's dad we're talking about back in 2000. For any of us who've ever lost a parent, I think there is that moment when you realize like there's no one ahead of me in the lineage.
You're the oldest now.
Yes.
I mean, like, it's coming to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that, strictly speaking, never became the case for Nita or me because our moms are still alive today, thank goodness.
But the idea of it.
But the idea of it,
Yeah.
it sets in.
Yes.
And that for me, that was a moment that set in really for the first time. Before that, I had lost grandparents, but that's something that, as much as I miss them, that's something that you kind of do as a kid or a teenager.
You sort of expect that.
You sort of expect that.
Yeah.
And this was seriously unexpected. So I think that did spark a whole lot of reflection on the part of both of us. In my case, it led to a whole lot of very serious conversations of a sort I had not had before.
Such as what?
Well, I, for example, started to have very regular lunches with an Episcopal priest, Bill Power. Wish he'd been in town then, but Bill's a great guy, and we had
Sure.
many conversations, oftentimes at a place called Food from Galilee in Snyder Plaza. Not always there, but we just got into a long set of conversations about where I am in life. So yes, that did lead to some pretty significant career decisions along the way. But I think in a more profound sense, it really did lead to a really significant new phase in thinking about life and mortality and what matters. So I can try to expand on that if you'd like, but it was undoubtedly a great, painful but moment of great transition for us.
I definitely think that facing death is one of the great fears. I mean, if we distill Christianity down to any little nugget, it's that death itself has been defeated, because death is the great scary moment. Regardless of how courageous a person is, death is the common denominator. None of us will make it out if you're alive.
Right.
And so at some point, as you did when Nita's father died, death becomes quite real. It comes much closer than theoretical. It's no longer at arm's length. It could be you.
Yes.
And that then begins a moment when you do change the way you see the world. You change what you value, who you are.
I think that you really do have a moment, and certainly I know I did, when death as such becomes less scary. And what starts to become more scary is the prospect of not living out this scarce time we have in the world as we want to live.
Is it fair to say that that kind of shift is perhaps what set the table, so to speak, for your courage? I'm just going to go with courage. Courage to actually, mid-career, make a big shift.
No question at all.
Yeah.
I don't think absent that it would have happened, at least not when it did. So that set in motion a whole lot of thinking of, well, it's not anymore going to be about frantic resume building and trying to, climb some sort
Ladder,
of mythical ladder ahead. It's going to be about trying to live right now. I will say it led for a number of years. I would say it led me in a number of undisciplined, but in retrospect, interesting directions.
What does that mean?
Well, I stepped up, for example, I think that in this sort of effort to kind of live in the now in a way that felt meaningful, that it was trying to live with integrity, live as I wanted to live. It probably got me. There was a moment where I probably started saying yes to quite a number of volunteer things to a degree that in retrospect may have been excessive. I would say when I look back on that time, it was a time when I kind of cast around in ways that helped make me who I am today. They were good. It was a good thing. It was a little bit, when you add it all up, all the various things that I spent time on, a little bit, like I said, there wasn't a linear story to it. It was a bit all over the place, but it was a good all over the place, and it did lead to not only what I'm doing now professionally, but I would say in a larger sense, how I'm living today.
Well, as we near the end of this conversation, I'm wondering how you have taken this experience, that experience of kind of facing death, letting it sink into you, evaluating how it might change you and what you could do in your own life differently. And being that you're a dad, many of the people watching this are going to be parents. How do you take that experience that you had almost unfortunately, certainly accidentally, and pass that on to your children in a way that maybe helps them to kind of get a little beyond that themselves? Like, God forbid they don't have that kind of experience themselves, but they still gain some of the benefit of having been challenged in that way to live their lives a bit more broadly. Well, I might say less about success and more about significance.
Boy, that's a tough one, because I think one of the, surely going back to Old Testament times, one of the classic challenges as a parent, right, is hopefully we live long enough to know some stuff. We try to transmit it, but then we come up against the reality that the next generation has to learn it their way
Themselves.
and not just listen to their forebears. So I'm sure you've lived with that. I've lived with that.
Definitely.
When I look at young people today, one thing that I can't help but be a little concerned about, we've never lived in a time of such abundance, plenty, prosperity. Certainly my daughters have benefited from that. But at the same time, it's also hard to, at least for quite some generations now, to think of a time when young people have been so anxious and anxious about not necessarily the larger meaning of life or something, but I mean anxious about will they have a good enough resume to get into the right school or to get the right job?
And so young.
Yes. So that is disturbing to me. That's not specifically about my kids. That's a general observation. I think my kids are part of their times. They've lived it to some degree. I've seen other kids probably have had it worse. But sure, I would like nothing more than to get the attention of my own 3 daughters and any other young person, to get them to understand that there will come a time when they recognize that frantic, hectic, stressed out resume building is they're going to run out of runway on that. There's going to come a time when they say, I can't do that anymore.
Well, not only that, but it's actually not as important as I thought it was.
Well, exactly. And just about everybody comes to that conclusion.
I hope so.
As far as I can tell.
Yes.
But they might come to it a little sooner. They might come to it a little bit later. I'm not real optimistic that we can truly persuade young people to never worry about it, right? They're going to. So sure, I've tried as a dad to to take up every possible opportunity I can to talk through whatever I've learned in my life and to discuss with our daughters whatever.
I kind of wonder if you're being vulnerable about how death impacted you and changed you, if nothing else, plants the seed that you understand whenever they hit that wall, whenever they have that experience that kind of pulls the rug out from under them, you know how that feels. They're not alone, and that they've got you to help them navigate all the complexity of whatever they're feeling in that moment to really make something good out of it, to really look at life with that courage.
I hope they think that way. I think one thing that's been distinctive for my daughters, at least, is they did see me wrestle with the decision to do the Ph.D. program. They also saw me wrestle with just trying to actually get through it. Particularly the first year, it was really, really hard. And they watched that, and they knew that I was sometimes kind of pulling my hair out, and that it was about the hardest thing I'd ever taken on. And certainly that influenced me. Like I better stay with it because they're watching. But I think in a larger sense, for them to see sort of the vulnerability and to see, well, it's worth it to stay at it and try the hard things, just to try to keep life fresh. And
the struggle is worth it.
Absolutely, the struggle is worth it.
Well, Cullum, I really appreciate you giving your time to be with us today. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Chris. I'm delighted to do it.
Absolutely. And thank you for taking time to be here with us. And remember, you have the power to be fearless.